Elise, Shadows of a Woman is a Brazilian crime thriller produced for Netflix, and it stands as one of the platform's biggest recent hits from Brazil. The film is based on the real-life story of Elise Matsunaga, who was convicted in 2012 of killing her husband, Brazilian businessman Marcos Matsunaga. The original title of the film in Portuguese is Elise, Sombras de uma Mulher, and it was directed by Felipe Velas, marking his feature directorial debut. The screenplay was written by Rafael Montes and Mariana Torres, the same writing team behind the acclaimed series Bom Dia, Veronica, and the film carries their distinctive approach, favoring psychology over procedure and interiority over straightforward reconstruction of events. The production company behind the film is Boutique Filmes, and it was distributed worldwide by Netflix. While discussing the intentions behind the project, the writer explained that the goal was never simply to depict a crime, but rather to explore the underlying factors and pressures that pushed Elise Matsunaga toward committing the murder, instead of concentrating purely on the violent act itself. The film runs for approximately 93 minutes and is presented almost entirely in the Portuguese language, reflecting its Brazilian origins and its grounding in a real case that shocked the entire nation. Since its release, the film has climbed rapidly up international viewership charts, reaching high positions both globally and specifically within the United States market, placing it among some of the most watched titles on the platform during its debut window. Plot details. The story of Elise, Shadows of a Woman does not follow a simple chronological structure. The narrative is divided into chapters and does not unfold entirely in order, beginning instead with the murder itself before returning to explain how the relationship reached that point. The film opens in May of 2012, in the immediate aftermath of the killing, showing Elise as she deals with the consequences of what she has just done, rather than showing the act itself in that opening sequence. From there, the story shifts backward roughly 7 years to reveal how Elise and Marcos first met, and how their relationship developed over time. At the beginning of their story, Elise worked as an escort, and it was through this line of work that she first encountered Marcos, a wealthy client who came from a powerful family that controlled a major food company. Marcos quickly became infatuated with Elise and expressed a strong desire to build a life with her, even though he was already married to another woman and had children from that earlier marriage. He showered Elise with extravagant gifts, promises of financial security, and the hope of a future together, including plans for a child of their own and an eventual divorce from his existing wife. As their relationship deepened, Marcos went to great lengths to convince Elise of his commitment, including providing her with an apartment, and other gestures meant to secure her loyalty to him. The film also delves into Elise's difficult background, revealing a childhood marked by family dysfunction. She grew up in the small town of Chopinzinho, in a modest household that struggled financially after her biological father abandoned the family. She was later raised largely by her grandparents, and when her mother eventually remarried, Elise's new stepfather subjected her and her stepsister to ongoing abuse during her early teenage years. This traumatic upbringing is portrayed as a major influence on the choices Elise made later in life, including her eventual move to the city and her decision to work in the escort industry as a means of survival and independence. As the relationship between Elise and Marcos progresses, the film shows their wedding plans unfolding, though not smoothly, since several men connected to the event turn out to be former clients of Elise's, creating tension and embarrassment. Marcos's own family is shown to be cold and dismissive toward her, with his father repeatedly getting her name wrong and the entire event remaining overshadowed by Marcos's prior marriage. Despite the couple's attempts to start a family, they initially struggle to conceive, and complications arise around fertility treatment. When Elise later discovers evidence of Marcos's infidelity, she initially demands a divorce, but shortly afterward becomes pregnant, and the couple decides to give their marriage another chance. Elise eventually gives birth to a daughter, yet Marcos continues his pattern of infidelity even after becoming a father, and the emotional toll on Elise deepens as she comes to feel increasingly trapped and diminished within the relationship, drained of the vitality she once had. By 2012, Elise discovers that Marcos is involved with another woman he intends to marry, sparking a violent argument between the couple. It is during this confrontation that Elise ultimately shoots Marcos. She then dismembers his body and disposes of the remains across different locations in the city, attempting to conceal what she has done. In the hours that follow, she fabricates a story to explain her husband's sudden disappearance to his family and to the authorities, even as evidence of the crime begins slowly surfacing. As Marcos's remains are discovered and eventually identified, investigators close in on Elise, and her fabricated explanations begin to unravel under scrutiny. She is ultimately arrested and confesses to the killing. The film closes by showing Elise writing a letter to her daughter following her arrest, and it reveals that she was found guilty by a jury and sentenced to a lengthy prison term, having lost contact with her daughter since the time of her arrest, with the story reflecting on how the crime altered the lives of everyone connected to it. Cast. The role of Elise Matsunaga is played by Lorena Comparato, who takes on the central role of the film and carries much of its emotional weight, portraying Elise's transformation from a hopeful young woman into someone worn down by her circumstances. Enrique Kimura plays Marcos Matsunaga, portraying the wealthy heir whose charm and generosity mask a pattern of manipulation and infidelity throughout the relationship. Denise Weinberg appears in the film as well, playing a family member connected to Elise's past. The supporting cast also includes performers portraying Elise's mother and stepfather, figures whose actions during her childhood are shown to have shaped much of her later life and decisions. Release date: Elise, Shadows of a Woman premiered worldwide on Netflix on July 22, 2026. Ahead of its release, Netflix had first announced the project back in July of 2025, alongside an early look image introducing Lorena Comparato in the role of Elise Matsunaga. Following its global premiere, the film quickly gained traction, climbing into the top rankings on Netflix's worldwide charts within just a few days, and reaching similarly high positions on the platform's charts within the United States as well, cementing its status as one of the standout streaming releases of that period. Trailer information. The official trailer for Elise, Shadows of a Woman was released by Netflix ahead of the film's premiere, giving audiences their first proper look at the dramatized retelling of the Matsunaga case. The trailer highlights the central themes of the film, presenting it as the story of a marriage destroyed by betrayal, jealousy, and violence, while showcasing Lorena Comparato's performance in the lead role. The trailer sets the tone for the psychological and emotional focus of the film, emphasizing the internal breakdown of the relationship rather than leaning into shock value, and it generated significant anticipation among audiences already familiar with the real case through previous news coverage and Netflix's earlier documentary series on the same story. The full story of Elise, Shadows of a Woman. Before the story begins in earnest, the film draws its audience into a single frozen moment. A woman standing over a body in an apartment high above Sao Paulo, the city's lights glittering coldly through the windows behind her, indifferent to what has just happened inside. Her hands are trembling, her breathing shallow, and for a few long seconds she does not move at all. This is Elise, and this is the morning after everything has already gone wrong. The film does not rush to explain how she arrived at this point. Instead, it lingers in the disorientation of the aftermath before pulling the audience backward, chapter by chapter, into the years that led to this apartment, this body, and this woman who once believed she was building a different kind of life entirely. To understand Elise, the film insists, one must first understand Chopinzinho, the small, unremarkable town in the Brazilian state of Paraná where she was born into a household already fracturing at the seams. Her father was a restless, unreliable man who drifted in and out of the family's life before abandoning them for good, leaving Eliza's mother to raise her children largely on her own in a town that offered few opportunities and even fewer comforts. For a time, young Elise was placed in the care of her grandparents, a period the film frames with a kind of fragile, temporary safety, as though the girl sensed even then that stability was not something she could count on for long. When her mother eventually returned to Chopin-Zinho and reclaimed her daughter, it seemed, briefly, as though something resembling a normal childhood might resume. That fragile normalcy did not last. Eliza's mother remarried, and the man she brought into the household did not bring safety with him. He brought fear. The film handles this portion of Eliza's history with a heavy, deliberate solemnity, never lingering on graphic detail but making unmistakably clear that the stepfather subjected Elise and her stepsister to repeated abuse throughout their early adolescence, and that he did so under the same roof where her mother slept, ate, and lived, seemingly unaware or unwilling to intervene. The film suggests, through several quiet, devastating scenes, that Elise tried more than once to signal what was happening to her, only to be met with disbelief or willful blindness from the one person who might have protected her. It is in these scenes that the film plants the psychological seeds it will return to again and again throughout the story, a girl learning, far too early, that the adults around her could not be trusted to shield her from harm, and that if she was going to survive, she would have to learn to protect herself. By her mid-teens, the pressure of her home life had become unbearable, and Elise made her first attempt to escape it, fleeing Chopin-Zinho in search of something better. The film treats this flight with a bittersweet honesty. The wider world she ran into was not the refuge she had imagined. Without money, without family support, and without the protections that come with age and experience, she found that the world beyond her hometown could be just as dangerous, if not more so, than the household she had left behind. Disillusioned and out of options, she eventually returned home, but the film makes clear that something in her had changed. She had resolved, quietly and firmly, that she would leave again one day, permanently, and that this time she would find a way to make it work. That determination eventually carried her out of Parana and into Sao Paulo, Brazil's largest and most unforgiving city, a place of extraordinary wealth sitting uneasily beside extraordinary poverty. Elise arrived with modest ambitions at first. She had trained as a nurse, hoping that a stable profession might offer her the independence she craved. But nursing alone could not provide the financial security she needed, and the film shows her, gradually and without excessive judgment, drifting into escort work, a decision framed less as a moral failing and more as a pragmatic response to a limited set of options available to a young woman without wealth, connections, or a safety net. Working for an agency known as VIP Class, Elise entered a world of expensive hotel rooms, wealthy clients, and carefully maintained appearances, learning to project confidence and allure even when the circumstances beneath that performance were far more precarious. It was through this work that Elise first crossed paths with Marcos Caetano Matsunaga, a man whose family name carried considerable weight in Brazilian business circles. Marcos was the heir to the Yoki food conglomerate, a company with deep roots and significant influence, and he arrived in Elise's life already surrounded by the trappings of inherited wealth, expensive cars, a comfortable home, and the easy confidence of a man who had never truly had to want for anything. He was also, crucially, already married, with children from that earlier marriage, a fact that complicated everything that followed but did little to slow down what began between him and Elise. The film portrays the early stages of their relationship as a kind of intoxicating imbalance. Marcos was immediately taken with Elise, drawn to her in a way that quickly moved past the transactional nature of their initial meetings. He began pursuing her not simply as a client but as a man determined to make her a permanent part of his life. He showered her with gifts, with promises, with visions of a future that stood in stark contrast to everything she had grown up with. He spoke of leaving his wife for her. He spoke of building a family together. He provided her with an apartment, a level of material comfort she had never before experienced, and even, in one of the film's more pointed symbolic gestures, gave her a pet snake as a token of his affection, a detail the film lets sit in the air without comment, allowing the audience to draw its own conclusions about what kind of gift that truly was. For Elise, the film suggests, this pursuit represented something far more significant than romance. It represented the possibility of finally escaping the instability that had defined her entire life up to that point. Marcos was offering her not just companionship but security, status, and a version of herself that had access to a world she had only ever glimpsed from the outside. The film is careful not to paint her as naively swept away by his money alone. It also shows genuine affection developing between them, moments of real tenderness and connection that complicate the later narrative of victimhood and manipulation. But even in these tender moments, the power imbalance between them is never allowed to fully disappear. Marcos held the money. Marcos held the status. Marcos held, in a very real sense, control over how much of the promised future Elise would actually receive. As their relationship deepened and Marcos moved toward finally divorcing his first wife, the film begins introducing the cracks that would eventually widen into the central fracture of the story. Marcos's family did not welcome Elise. His father, in one of the film's quietly humiliating running details, repeatedly failed to get her name right, a small but pointed gesture of disrespect that the film uses to illustrate just how little the Matsuniga family thought of the woman their son intended to marry. Wedding preparations, when they finally began, were fraught with awkwardness and embarrassment, as several men connected to the event, guests, associates, and acquaintances of Marcos, turned out to be former clients of Elise's from her time working as an escort. The film lingers on Elise's discomfort in these moments, showing her forced to smile and perform normalcy in social settings where she was constantly at risk of being recognized, judged, or exposed, all while trying to build a new identity as Marcos's wife rather than as the woman she had once been. The wedding itself proceeds, but the film frames it less as a joyous beginning and more as the formalization of an arrangement already showing signs of strain. Marcos's first marriage and his children from that relationship continue to loom over the new union, a persistent reminder that Elise was not simply stepping into an empty space but into a life Marcos had already lived once before, with all the complications that entailed. And almost immediately, the promises that had once seemed so central to their courtship begin to reveal their limits. The film does not depict a single dramatic turning point where everything changes overnight. Instead, it builds a slow accumulation of disappointments and betrayals, small at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. One of the earliest and most painful of these disappointments involves the couple's attempts to start a family. Elise and Marcos want a child together, and the film shows their efforts to conceive running into difficulty, requiring fertility treatment that adds both physical and emotional strain to a relationship already carrying significant weight. This period is portrayed with a quiet sadness, Elise's hope for a child intertwined with her hope for a version of her life that finally feels secure and permanent, a family of her own making rather than the fractured one she left behind in Chopinzinho. It is during this same period that Elise first discovers clear evidence of Marcos's infidelity. The film handles this discovery with a controlled, simmering intensity rather than a single explosive confrontation. She finds signs, messages, and indications that Marcos has been unfaithful, continuing to pursue relationships with other women even as he was building a life and a marriage with her. For Elise, this discovery lands with a particular kind of devastation, not simply because of the betrayal itself, but because of what it reveals about the nature of the promises Marcos had made to her in the first place. If he could be unfaithful to his first wife in pursuit of Elise, the film suggests she begins to understand, there was never any guarantee he would not do the same to her. Elise's initial response to this discovery is to demand a divorce, and for a moment, the film allows the possibility that she might actually leave, that she might recognize the pattern early enough to extract herself from it before it consumes her further. But circumstances intervene. Shortly after this confrontation, Elise becomes pregnant, and the pregnancy becomes the catalyst for a reconciliation neither of them had necessarily planned. The film treats this turn with a certain grim inevitability, showing how the prospect of a child pulls both of them back into the relationship, Marcos eager to preserve the appearance of a stable family, and Elise hopeful, against mounting evidence to the contrary, that the arrival of their daughter might finally give Marcos a reason to change. Their daughter is born, and the film allows itself a brief window of genuine warmth here, showing Elise as a devoted mother, finding in her new child a source of meaning and connection that feels untainted by the complications surrounding her marriage. But this warmth is short-lived within the larger arc of the story. Marcos, the film makes unmistakably clear, does not change. His infidelities continue even after the birth of their daughter, and the film depicts a marriage in which Elise is increasingly isolated, increasingly aware of her own diminished position within a household that Marcos ultimately controls, financially, socially, and emotionally. She is dependent on him in ways that make leaving far more complicated than it might once have been, and the film uses this period to trace her gradual transformation from the hopeful, determined young woman who arrived in Sao Paulo years earlier into someone worn down, watchful, and increasingly desperate, a woman who has, in the language the film's own title gestures toward, become something like a shadow of herself. The film does not shy away from showing the psychological toll this takes on Elise. There are scenes of quiet humiliation, moments where Marcos dismisses her concerns, questions her perception of events, and at times suggests, in ways both subtle and overt, that she is imagining problems that do not exist. This pattern, the film implies without ever using clinical language to describe it, constitutes its own form of control, a slow erosion of Elise's confidence in her own judgment that leaves her increasingly unable to trust her own read on the relationship she is living inside. Marcos, for his part, is shown continuing to move through the world with the easy confidence of a man who has never faced meaningful consequences for his behavior, a man who assumes, not without reason given how the relationship has unfolded so far, that Elise will ultimately stay regardless of what he does. As the film moves toward its climax, set in the year 2012, the tension that has been building steadily throughout the story finally reaches its breaking point. Elise discovers that Marcos has become involved with yet another woman, this time with the apparent intention of marrying her, a revelation that goes beyond the pattern of infidelity Elise had already come to expect and instead suggests Marcos is preparing to replace her entirely, just as he had once left his first wife for her. The film frames this discovery as the final unraveling of whatever illusions Elise had managed to maintain about the future of her marriage. She confronts Marcos directly, and the confrontation that follows is depicted with a rawness and intensity that stands apart from the more restrained, simmering tone of much of the film that precedes it. The argument between them escalates rapidly. The film shows Marcos returning home, seemingly unaware of how far the situation has deteriorated, carrying with him the ordinary detritus of an evening, a takeaway meal, the casual indifference of a man who does not yet realize the magnitude of what is about to happen. Elise is waiting for him, and the confrontation that follows draws on all of the accumulated weight of years of betrayal, humiliation, and diminishment that the film has spent its runtime carefully constructing. In the heat of that confrontation, Elise shoots Marcos. The film does not dwell on this moment with gratuitous detail, choosing instead to convey its horror through restraint, through the sound of the gunshot, through Elise's own shock in its immediate aftermath, and through the sudden, irreversible silence that follows. What comes next is perhaps the most difficult stretch of the film to watch, not because of graphic violence but because of the chilling calm with which Elise proceeds. In the hours after the killing, she begins the grim task of disposing of the evidence, dismembering Marcos's body and preparing to remove it from the apartment. The film handles this sequence with careful restraint, suggesting the horror of what is happening more through sound design, through Elise's expression, and through the fragmented, disorienting editing of the sequence, than through explicit visual depiction. Even in the midst of this, ordinary life intrudes. The family's nanny arrives for her usual shift early the next morning, and Elise, forced to maintain composure under extraordinary pressure, hands over her daughter and instructs the nanny to keep her occupied in another room, buying herself time to continue the task at hand. When Elise finally leaves the apartment carrying the remains of her husband packed into suitcases, she encounters the nanny once more on her way out, and in a moment the film uses to underscore just how far Elise has traveled from the person she once was. She calmly explains that the suitcases contain wine bottles she is delivering elsewhere. The lie lands, at least for the moment, and Elise proceeds out into the city. The film follows her through a tense, rain-soaked sequence in which she must navigate a routine police checkpoint without arousing suspicion, a scene the film uses to build considerable tension even though the audience already knows, from the film's opening, that Elise's eventual arrest is inevitable. Eventually, she reaches a rural area outside the city and disposes of the suitcases containing Marcos's remains, discarding as well the wedding ring that had once symbolized the future she believed she was building with him. In the days that follow, the film shifts its focus to the growing panic within Marcos's family as his absence becomes impossible to explain away. Elise constructs an elaborate story to account for his disappearance, maintaining her composure even as the people around her grow increasingly suspicious. The film shows Marcos's best friend and close associates beginning to question the account Elise has offered, their unease growing as inconsistencies begin to surface. Slowly, and with mounting dread, the remains of Marcos's body begin to be discovered in the areas where Elise had scattered them, and it becomes only a matter of time before authorities are able to confirm his identity and begin piecing together what actually happened. The investigation that follows is depicted with a steady, procedural tension, the film's tone shifting from the intimate, claustrophobic dynamics of the marriage into something closer to a slow-motion unraveling. Police investigators arrive at the apartment Elise and Marcos shared, beginning a methodical search for clues, and the film shows Elise's carefully constructed story beginning to fracture under the weight of physical evidence and inconsistent details. Rather than depicting a dramatic chase or a prolonged standoff, the film opts for something quieter and, in its own way, more unsettling: the slow, inexorable collapse of a cover-up that was never going to hold, carried out by a woman who, despite the calculation evident in her actions after the murder, was never a criminal mastermind so much as a person acting out of desperation and panic in the aftermath of an act she likely never fully planned to commit. Eventually, Elise is brought in for questioning, and it is here, under the pressure of direct interrogation, that her fabricated account of Marcos's disappearance finally gives way entirely. The film portrays her confession not as a moment of dramatic collapse but as something closer to exhaustion, a woman who has spent days maintaining an impossible fiction finally allowing the truth to surface because she no longer has the strength, or perhaps the will, to keep sustaining the lie. She admits to killing Marcos, and the film treats this confession with a certain solemn gravity, either excusing what she has done nor reducing her to a simple monster, instead maintaining the complicated, dual portrait it has constructed throughout. A woman shaped by profound trauma and sustained mistreatment, who nonetheless made a choice, in a moment of extremity, that cannot be undone and that carries devastating consequences not only for her but for everyone connected to her, including, most painfully, her own young daughter. The film's final act deals with the aftermath of Elise's arrest, portraying her awaiting trial and grappling with the reality of what her life has become. In one of the film's most quietly devastating scenes, Elise is shown writing a letter to her daughter, an attempt to explain herself, or perhaps simply to leave behind some fragment of connection to a child she now understands she may never be able to properly raise. The film does not resolve the ambiguity at the heart of Elise's story in this final stretch. It does not definitively declare her a victim of circumstance driven to an unthinkable act by years of abuse and betrayal, nor does it fully endorse the alternative reading offered by prosecutors and skeptics, that Elise acted with calculation and self-interest, motivated in part by the substantial inheritance and business interests connected to Marcos's family fortune. Instead, the film allows both possibilities to coexist, trusting the audience to sit with the discomfort of a story that resists easy moral categorization. Ultimately, Elise is found guilty by a jury, though the film notes, in its closing passages, that even the jury appeared to view the killing as a crime of passion rather than a coldly premeditated act, a nuance that speaks to just how divided public opinion remained even after the verdict. She is sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and the film closes by reflecting on the broader consequences of what took place inside that Sao Paulo apartment: a family shattered, a young girl growing up without either of her parents present in her daily life, and a case that captivated an entire country not simply because of its violence, but because of the uncomfortable questions it raised about power, dependency, abuse, and the different forms control can take within an intimate relationship. Marcos's family is left to grapple with the loss of one of their own in the most horrifying circumstances imaginable, while Elise is left to grapple with the full weight of what she has done, isolated from the daughter who represented, for a time, the one hopeful thread running through an otherwise increasingly desperate life. In its final moments, the film pulls back from the specifics of Elise and Marcos's story to gesture towards something larger, situating this single tragic case within a broader pattern of relationships defined by profound imbalances of power and wealth, relationships in which one partner holds nearly every lever of control while the other is left to navigate an increasingly narrow set of choices. The title itself, Shadows of a Woman, is left to resonate in these closing scenes, a reference to the way Elise's own sense of self seemed to fade and diminish across the years depicted in the film, from a hopeful young woman determined to build a better life for herself, into someone reduced, piece by piece, until almost nothing recognizable remained of who she once was. The film leaves its audience not with a tidy conclusion, but with an uneasy, lingering meditation on how ordinary lives, shaped by desperation, longing, and unchecked power, can spiral toward irreversible tragedy, and on how difficult it remains, even years later, to determine exactly where responsibility, blame, and circumstance truly begin and end. The actors behind Elise, Shadows of a Woman. Lorena Comparato. The actress at the center of Elise, Shadows of a Woman, carrying the demanding lead role of Elise Matsunaga, is Lorena Comparato, a performer whose career has been building steadily across Brazilian television, film, and theater for well over a decade before this role brought her to a new level of international attention. Lorena de Souza Mendes Comparato was born on March 14, 1990, and although she is widely recognized today as one of Brazil's most versatile working actresses, her actual place of birth was Lisbon, Portugal, a detail that has shaped both her legal identity and her professional trajectory in ways that are not always immediately obvious to audiences who primarily know her through Brazilian television and streaming projects. Because of her birth in Portugal, Lorena holds dual citizenship, both Portuguese and Brazilian, with her Portuguese citizenship formally recognized once she reached the age of 8. This dual identity, split between two countries that share a language but differ enormously in culture, history, and artistic tradition, would go on to quietly inform much of her early life and the winding path that eventually led her back to Brazil to build her acting career. Lorena was born into a family already deeply embedded in the world of Brazilian storytelling and performance. Her father is Doc Comparato, a well-known and highly respected Brazilian screenwriter whose work has left a significant mark on the country's television and film industries, and her mother is Leila Mendes, a professional speech coach whose expertise in vocal training and performance technique would later prove directly relevant to her daughter's own artistic development. Growing up in a household where storytelling, language, and performance were not abstract concepts but the literal family business gave Lorena an early and intimate exposure to the craft she would eventually pursue professionally. She is not the only performer in her family, either. Lorena has two older sisters, Bianca and Fabiana, both of whom carved out their own creative paths, with Bianca becoming an accomplished actress in her own right, known internationally for her starring role in a popular Brazilian science fiction series that found a global audience after being picked up by a major streaming platform, and Fabiana pursuing work as a screenwriter, continuing the family's tradition of narrative craftsmanship from behind the camera rather than in front of it. Growing up alongside sisters who were themselves pursuing careers in performance and writing meant that Lorena's childhood was saturated with creative influence, discussion, and encouragement from a very early age, and the sibling dynamic between the Comparado sisters has remained a notable thread throughout their public lives, occasionally surfacing in interviews where Lorena has spoken candidly about her relationship with her sister Bianca and the shared experience of navigating the entertainment industry as siblings. For a significant stretch of her childhood, Lorena's family lived in Sintra, Portugal, a picturesque town known for its romantic architecture and historic palaces, before eventually relocating to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where the family would put down more permanent roots. This transition between countries during her formative years meant that Lorena's early education carried an unusually international flavor, blending Portuguese and Brazilian cultural influences in a way that many of her peers in the Brazilian entertainment industry did not experience firsthand. She began studying theater from a young age, absorbing the fundamentals of performance well before she ever set foot on a professional set, and this early theatrical training would form the foundation upon which the rest of her career was built. Her formal education continued to reflect this deep commitment to the craft. She attended school in Rio de Janeiro, where she took part in drama classes, before going on to enroll at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, one of Brazil's most respected institutions of higher learning, where she earned a bachelor's degree in communications. During her time at university, Lorena also took part in an international student exchange program, spending time studying at the University of California, an experience that exposed her to American academic and creative environments and broadened her perspective beyond the borders of Brazil and Portugal alone. Her education did not stop there. She went on to pursue a master's degree in performing arts at the Escola Superior de Artes Célia Helena in São Paulo, a well-regarded institution for actors seeking advanced training, further deepening her technical command of her craft even as she was already actively working as a professional actress. Beyond her formal degrees, Lorena has also participated in numerous specialized acting workshops over the years, studying under a range of respected instructors and coaches, an ongoing commitment to refining her technique that speaks to a performer who has never treated acting as something to be mastered once and then coasted on, but rather as a discipline requiring continuous growth. Lorena's professional career began not with dramatic acting at all, but with television presenting. As a child, she appeared on TV Globinho, a children's programming block on Brazil's massive Rede Globo network, where she worked as a young host between 2009 and 2012, learning the rhythms of live television and audience engagement long before she transitioned into scripted dramatic work. This early presenting experience gave her a comfort in front of the camera that would serve her well as she moved into acting proper. Her actual television acting debut came with the drama series Fora de Controle in 2012, a role that marked her formal entry into scripted performance. That same year proved to be a remarkably active one for the young actress, as she also took on the role of Brittany Santos in the romantic drama series Do Amor, and appeared in a comedy series as well, quickly demonstrating a range that spanned both dramatic and comedic registers even at the very outset of her career. From there, her filmography expanded steadily and diversely. She became known for a wide range of television projects across numerous networks and streaming platforms, including Samantha, which holds the distinction of being the first Brazilian comedy series produced for Netflix, a genuinely significant milestone in the platform's early investment in Brazilian original content. She also earned considerable acclaim for her role in Impuros, a crime drama that aired on Star Plus and Fox Premium, where her performance as a character named Guy earned her an International Emmy nomination, one of the most prestigious forms of recognition available to television performers working outside the United States, and placing her firmly among the ranks of internationally recognized Brazilian talent. Her television credits over the years have been extensive and varied, spanning telenovelas, comedies, and dramas across virtually every major Brazilian network and several international streaming services. She appeared in the soap opera Rock Story in 2016, taking on a substantial role that ran across well over 100 episodes, giving her the kind of sustained, long-form character work that telenovelas are famous for demanding of their performers. She has also appeared in Forbidden City, TOC's The Delilah EAI, Open Bar, and Crossing the Line, among numerous other projects, building a filmography that reflects the sheer breadth of Brazilian television production and her ability to move fluidly between genres and formats. Beyond television, Lorena has also built a respectable film career, having appeared in more than 10 feature films across her career. One of her more notable film credits is Lacuna, released in 2021 and directed by Rodrigo Lages, in which she did not simply serve as the film's lead performer but also took on the role of associate producer, marking an important step in her development beyond acting alone and into the production side of filmmaking. A transition that many actors pursue as they mature in their careers and seek greater creative control over the projects they attach themselves to. Theater has remained a consistent and important thread throughout Lorena's career, reflecting the foundational role that stage training played in her earliest development as a performer. In 2011, she became a member of a theater group called CIA de Quatro Mulheres, formed alongside 3 other actresses, Andretza Abreu, Anita Chavez, and Karina Ramel. This collective would go on to have a meaningful impact on her career beyond the stage itself, as the 4 women eventually wrote and starred in a television project together, and were also responsible for producing Brazil's first scripted fiction podcast, distributed through Spotify Brazil, demonstrating an entrepreneurial and collaborative streak that runs alongside her more conventional acting work. Over the years, she has appeared in numerous stage productions in Brazil, including August Osage County, a demanding ensemble drama, as well as several other Portuguese-language productions that allowed her to continue honing her craft in the more immediate, unforgiving environment of live theater, where mistakes cannot be edited out and performances must be sustained in real time in front of an audience. Her earlier film work includes a period of collaboration with director Anita Rocha de Silveira, most notably on the short film Kill Me Please, released in 2015, a project that went on to receive nominations and recognition at several respected international festivals, including Indie Lisboa, a festival in Munich, the Rio de Janeiro International Film Festival, and the Venice Horizons section of the Venice Film Festival, one of the most prestigious platforms in world cinema for recognizing emerging and independent voices. She had already demonstrated her ability to earn critical recognition even earlier in her career, having won a Best Actress award at the Morelia Festival for her performance in the short film Handball back in 2010. Suggesting that the talent and critical attention she would later receive on a larger scale had been evident to close observers of Brazilian independent cinema from very early on. Taking on the role of Elise Matsunaga represented an especially demanding challenge for Lorena, given the emotional and psychological complexity required to portray a real woman at the center of one of Brazil's most notorious and divisive true crime cases. The role demanded that she embody a character whose journey spans years of the story, from a hopeful young woman navigating a precarious existence in Sao Paulo to a wife enduring sustained emotional deterioration within her marriage, and ultimately to a woman capable of an act of shocking violence. Critics who reviewed the film following its release were largely in agreement that Lorena's performance was the standout element of the production, with several reviewers specifically praising her ability to communicate Elise's psychological unraveling through subtle, controlled physical and emotional choices rather than through any single dramatic outburst, allowing the character's transformation to feel earned and gradual rather than abrupt. Even critics who found other elements of the film's screenplay or structure lacking tended to single out her committed, dedicated approach to the title role as the film's most compelling and memorable achievement, a testament to the years of theatrical and dramatic training she has accumulated across a career that, by the time this film reached audiences, had already spanned well over a decade of consistent, wide-ranging professional work. Enrique Kimura. Opposite Lorena Comparado, taking on the role of Marcos Kitano Matsunaga, the wealthy heir whose infidelity and manipulation formed the central destabilizing force of the film's narrative, is the Brazilian actor Enrique Kimura. Compared to his co-star, detailed public biographical information about Enrique Kimura's early life, education, and personal background remains considerably more limited, a common reality for performers who have built their careers primarily within Brazil's television, digital content, and regional entertainment scenes rather than through the kind of extensive press coverage that tends to follow performers who break through on globally distributed telenovelas or long-running network dramas. From a young age, what is clear from his public professional presence is that Kimura has spent a substantial part of his career working across multiple facets of the entertainment industry, building a reputation not only as a dramatic actor but also as a comedic performer and content creator with a distinct and recognizable persona. One of the most prominent threads running through Enrique Kimura's public career is his work as the face and creative force behind a comedic digital series known by its Portuguese title, which translates roughly to something like an outburst or a rant from a Japanese man. This ongoing project, presented across platforms including television, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, sees Kimura portraying a nervous, animated, and frequently exasperated character who comments, in an exaggerated and humorous style, on the everyday absurdities, frustrations, and social dynamics of life in Brazil. The character he plays in this recurring digital series is known for his energetic, almost frantic delivery, tackling everything from the peculiarities of Brazilian social behavior to more universal observations about human nature, frequently returning to a central message about the importance of living authentically and pursuing happiness despite the world's chaos and contradictions. This body of comedic work has built Kimura a substantial and loyal following across social media platforms, where his short-form videos have circulated widely and established him as a recognizable comedic personality independent of his more dramatic film and television roles. The persona he has built through this project reveals a performer with a strong sense of comic timing and an ability to sustain a distinct character voice across a large volume of content, skills that, while quite different on their surface from the restrained, internalized dramatic work required to play a character like Marcos Matsunaga, nonetheless speak to a broader range of performance ability and creative control over his own material than a single dramatic film role might suggest. Beyond this digital comedic persona, Kimura has built a filmography that includes work across Brazilian television and film, taking on a variety of acting roles as his career has developed. His casting as Marcos Matsunaga in Elise, Shadows of a Woman represents one of the more high-profile dramatic roles of his career to date, placing him opposite one of Brazil's most recognized dramatic actresses in a story that has captured national, and, following the film's release on a global streaming platform, considerable international attention as well. The role of Marcos required Kimura to inhabit a character who is, in many ways, deeply unsympathetic. Marcos is portrayed throughout the film as a man who uses his family's wealth and social standing to manipulate and control those around him, who is repeatedly unfaithful even as he professes commitment and love, and whose casual cruelty toward Elise, dismissing her concerns, undermining her sense of reality, and ultimately preparing to discard her in favor of yet another relationship, forms much of the emotional engine driving the film's tragic trajectory. Playing a character audiences are meant to find charming enough to explain why Elise was drawn to him in the first place, while simultaneously conveying the entitlement and casual disregard that made the marriage so corrosive over time, required a delicate balancing act. And reviewers who engaged with the film's central relationship dynamic generally noted that Kimura's performance succeeded in making Marcos believable as both a seductive, magnetic presence in the film's earlier passages and a genuinely troubling figure as the story progressed toward its violent conclusion. Kimura's approach to his craft, as suggested by the range of his public works spanning dramatic film performance and sustained comedic character work across digital platforms, reflects a performer who has built a career through versatility and consistent output rather than through a single breakout role that instantly elevated him to major stardom. This kind of career trajectory, common among working actors in Brazil's large and diverse entertainment industry, often involves moving fluidly between television, film, digital content, and other media as opportunities arise, building a body of work and an audience gradually over time rather than through one singular defining moment. His involvement in Elise, Shadows of a Woman, a project produced by a respected production company and distributed globally through Netflix, represents a significant opportunity for him to reach a considerably larger international audience than his previous work, particularly given the film's rapid rise up global streaming charts following its release, exposing his performance to viewers around the world who may have had no prior familiarity with his earlier comedic or dramatic work in the Brazilian market. Denise Weinberg. Rounding out the film's principal cast in a significant supporting role is Denise Weinberg, portraying Aunt Marta, a member of Elise's extended family who appears during the film's exploration of Elise's difficult upbringing and troubled relationship with her mother and stepfather back in her hometown. Unlike her younger co-stars, Denise Weinberg arrives at this project as a veteran of Brazilian theater, film, and television, with a career stretching back nearly 5 decades and a body of work that has established her as one of the most respected and consistently working actresses in the country's performing arts landscape. Denise Espíndola Weinberg was born on April 26, 1956, in Rio de Janeiro, and her full biography reveals a performer whose path into acting was not entirely a straight line from childhood ambition to professional career. Before fully dedicating herself to the stage, Denise trained and worked as a biologist, carrying a deep and lasting passion for neuroscience that has remained part of her intellectual identity even decades into her acting career. She has spoken in interviews about this earlier chapter of her life with a mixture of nostalgia and philosophical reflection, describing her eventual departure from that more conventionally scientific path into the world of performance as something she experienced almost as fate or destiny finding her, rather than a decision she consciously engineered from the outset. This unusual background, moving from the rigor and empirical discipline of biological science into the emotionally driven, interpretive world of professional theater, has given Denise a distinctive perspective on her craft that she has carried with her throughout a career defined by intellectual seriousness and a deep commitment to text, character, and dramaturgical rigor. Denise's family background includes Jewish heritage on her father's side, as her father was a merchant who had emigrated to Brazil from Romania, adding another layer to the rich, multicultural tapestry that characterizes so many prominent figures in Brazilian arts and culture, a country built substantially through waves of immigration from across Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and beyond. Her mother was named Elsa Espíndola Weinberg, and Denise herself trained formally in theater, building the technical foundation that would support a career spanning theater, film, television, and more recently digital media as well. The defining institutional relationship of Denise Weinberg's early and middle career was her long association with Grupo Tapa, a respected Brazilian theater company that she helped found and with which she remained closely involved for approximately 21 years, an extraordinarily long tenure that speaks to the depth of her commitment to a particular artistic community and creative philosophy. She was also involved with the group's Associated Theater Workshop, and her artistic formation and maturation as a performer are, by her own account and by the accounts of those who have written about her career, deeply intertwined with the history and evolution of Grupo Tapa itself. During her many years with the company, she appeared in an extensive string of theatrical productions, many of them directed by Eduardo Tolentino de Araujo, a frequent collaborator throughout this period of her career. Her early stage credits include a production called Apenas Canto de Fadas in 1979, followed by O Anneli Rosa in 1980, based on the work of William Makepeace Thackeray, and Tragico Acidente Destino Teresa in 1981, written by the respected Brazilian actor and writer José Wilker. She continued this prolific stage output with Tempo Quente na Floresta Azul in 1982, and in 1983 she took on a work by the legendary Brazilian playwright Nelson Rodrigues, appearing in Viúva, Porém Honesta, a role that placed her within the canon of one of Brazil's most significant dramatic voices. The following year, working with a different company called Teatro dos Quatro, Denise took on the demanding role in Anton Chekhov's Tio Vania, directed by Sergio Brito, a performance that earned her a nomination for Best Actress at the Troféu Mambembe, one of Brazil's respected theatrical honors. Her stage career continued to accumulate both volume and critical recognition over the ensuing decades. In 1991, she won the prestigious Molière Award for Best Actress for her performance in a Portuguese-language production of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, a significant honor within Brazilian theater circles. She followed this with appearances in Quero, based on the work of Plinio Marcos, in 1992, and Senora Klein in 1993, a production based on the play by Nicholas Wright. That same year, she received a second Molière Award, this time for her performance in Vestido de Noiva, another work by Nelson Rodrigues, cementing her reputation as one of the era's most consistently celebrated interpreters of serious dramatic material. In 1997, her performance in Do Fundo do Lago Escuro, written by Domingos Oliveira, earned her the Premio Mambembe for Best Actress, adding yet another significant honor to an already impressive collection. Her interpretation of a character in Plinio Marcos's Navalha na Carne in 1999 was singled out by respected Brazilian theater critic Alberto Guzik, who praised her ability to bring depth and genuine pain to a role that could easily have been played for cheap sensationalism, noting that rather than emphasizing the vulgarity often associated with the character, Denise instead foregrounded the underlying suffering, a description that speaks to the thoughtful, emotionally intelligent approach she has consistently brought to challenging material throughout her career. Around the year 2000, Denise stepped back from her long-standing formal involvement with Grupo Tapa, though she has continued to work steadily across theater, film, and television in the decades since, collaborating with a wide range of other directors, companies, and productions. Her film career, which began somewhat later than her extensive theatrical work, made its debut in 1997 with her appearance in Guerra de Canudos, directed by Sergio Rezende, a filmmaker with whom she would go on to collaborate on multiple subsequent projects. Since that debut, she has appeared in roughly a dozen feature films, with particularly notable credits including Quase Nada in 2000 and Salve Geral in 2009, the latter of which earned her a Best Supporting Actress award, further cementing her standing as a performer capable of bringing depth and nuance even to roles that exist outside the central spotlight of a film's narrative. Her more recent film work includes The Blue Trail, released in 2025 and directed by Gabriel Mascaro, in which she played a leading role as a character named Teresa, a performance she has described in interviews as personally transformative, noting the physical, almost visceral reaction she experiences when reading material that resonates with her on a deep level. A sensation she has described as a kind of trembling recognition that occurs when a script or role connects with something essential in her as a performer. This description offers meaningful insight into how Denise approaches the selection and interpretation of her roles even at this advanced stage of her career, suggesting a performer who continues to choose projects based on genuine artistic and emotional connection rather than simply accumulating credits. Her television career has been similarly extensive, spanning decades of Brazilian broadcast history. She made her television debut in 2008 in the HBO series Alice, and went on to appear in numerous other television productions across major Brazilian networks, including Mesa, based on the life of the famous Brazilian singer, and Dalva e Haravelto, both produced for Rede Globo. She also appeared in the HBO series Psy, a role for which she received a nomination for Best Actress at the International Emmy Awards in 2018, one of the most significant forms of international recognition available to a performer working primarily within Brazilian television, placing her achievements alongside the finest television performers working anywhere in the world during that awards cycle. Her more recent television credits include appearances in the telenovela Amor Eterno Amor, the series A Teia, and Eramos Cis, a well-regarded global production. Her film credits from the more recent stretch of her career include Greta, Meu Amigo Hindu, and both the second and third installments of the popular comedy franchise De Pernas Pro AR, demonstrating that even well into her 60s, Denise has continued to work steadily across a wide range of genres, from serious dramatic material to broader mainstream comedy, reflecting both her versatility and her continued relevance within an industry that does not always make sustained space for actresses across such a long span of their careers. Throughout her professional life, Denise has also maintained an active role as an educator, teaching at institutions including the Escola Livre de Teatro in Santo André, passing along the discipline, technique, and philosophy she developed over her own decades in the profession to younger generations of performers. In interviews, she has spoken candidly, and sometimes pointedly about the current state of Brazilian theater, expressing concern about shortened production runs and what she views as a diminished culture of rigorous preparation among some younger artists, reflecting the perspective of a performer who came up through an era defined by long-term company commitments, sustained rehearsal periods, and deep collaborative relationships with directors and fellow actors, a working model that has become less common within the more fragmented, faster-paced entertainment landscape of recent decades. She has described her profession, somewhat wryly, as having become something closer to a hobby for many of today's performers, given how much of contemporary entertainment work now unfolds around the edges of other jobs and commitments rather than through the kind of career-long dedication to a single company or discipline that defined her own formative years in the theater. Her personal life has included 2 marriages, the first lasting from 1978 to 1980, during which she had a son named João Gabriel, and a later marriage to fellow actor Hernani Moraes, lasting from 1986 to 2001. Across a career now spanning more than 60 productions, Denise Weinberg has built one of the more distinguished and respected bodies of work in Brazilian performing arts, and her presence in Elise, Shadows of a Woman, even in a supporting capacity, brings a level of theatrical gravity and craft to the film that reflects the kind of seasoned, deeply trained performer capable of grounding emotionally difficult material with authenticity and restraint, qualities that have defined her work across nearly 5 decades on Brazilian stages and screens. Behind the scenes of Elise, Shadows of a Woman. Before diving into this one, a quick and honest note for viewers. Unlike some of the lighter blockbuster productions this channel has covered before, Elise, Shadows of a Woman is a somber dramatization built around a real tragedy, the murder and dismemberment of a real man, Marcos Matsunaga, and the documented, difficult life story of a real woman, Elise Matsunaga. Because of that, there is no widely reported production budget attached to this film, and there are no documented light-hearted or comedic anecdotes from its set circulating in interviews or press coverage, which is not surprising given the tone the filmmakers were clearly striving for throughout the entire process. What follows instead is a detailed look at how this project actually came together behind the camera, the choices its creative team made, and the genuine challenges of adapting one of Brazil's most divisive true crime cases for a global streaming audience. The origins of Elise, Shadows of a Woman trace back to a production company called Boutique Filmes, a Brazilian outfit that had already spent more than a decade building a reputation for telling impactful, deeply researched Brazilian stories, with a strong footprint in the international market and partnerships across major streaming platforms including Netflix, Globoplay, Amazon Prime Video, Disney+, and Max Boutique Filmace was not approaching the Matsunaga case for the first time when this film was announced. The company had already produced a 4-part documentary series on the same subject back in 2021, titled Elise Matsunaga, Once Upon a Crime, which drew heavily on an exclusive first-person interview with Elise herself, giving the production team an unusually deep, direct well of first-hand material to draw from when they eventually decided to return to the story in dramatized form years later. This meant that by the time work began on the fictionalized feature film, the studio was not approaching the material as outsiders piecing together a story from newspaper clippings and courtroom transcripts. They were returning to a subject they had already spent years living inside, with existing relationships, existing archival interview footage, and an institutional understanding of exactly how sensitive and divisive this particular case remained in the Brazilian public consciousness. Netflix formally announced the project on July 29, 2025, releasing a first-look image of Lorena Comparato in character as Elise Matsunaga to accompany the announcement, a fairly standard piece of promotional rollout, but one that immediately generated conversation given how well-known and how contentious the underlying case still was among Brazilian audiences more than a decade after the crime itself took place. The screenplay was developed by Rafael Montes, a well-regarded Brazilian author and screenwriter previously known for his work on the acclaimed series Good Morning, Veronica, working in close collaboration with Mariana Torres, who had also contributed to that same series during its later seasons. Their partnership on this project extended beyond simply writing the script. Montes also took on a role as associate producer, giving him a hand not just in shaping the narrative on the page but in some of the broader decisions about how that narrative would ultimately be realized on screen. Directing duties fell to Felipe Velas, previously known for his work on the Netflix Brazilian crime drama Criminal Code, and this film ultimately marked his feature directorial debut, a significant milestone for a filmmaker who had built his reputation primarily in television before taking on a project of this scale and sensitivity as his first full-length film. The core producing team behind the film was led by Gustavo Melo, who served as producer, with Renata Artigas, Marcelo Maximo, and Adriana Gasper all serving as executive producers overseeing the project. This is a relatively lean, tightly knit production structure compared to many larger-scale international films, which often involve sprawling networks of co-financing partners and layers of executive oversight. The comparatively compact producing team here reflects the nature of the project itself, a Brazilian-language psychological drama produced primarily for a streaming release rather than a theatrical blockbuster requiring the kind of massive multinational financing arrangements that come with big-budget action or franchise filmmaking. Because Elise, Shadows of a Woman was developed and released as a Netflix original without any theatrical distribution component, the film also did not need to account for the kinds of costs associated with a traditional box office rollout, prints and advertising spending, theatrical marketing campaigns, or staggered international release windows. It was built from the outset as a day-and-date global streaming release, arriving simultaneously across every territory where Netflix operates on July 22, 2026, which is itself a meaningful behind-the-scenes decision, since it meant the entire marketing and promotional push, including the trailer campaign, had to be coordinated for one single global drop rather than a rolling international release strategy. One of the more significant behind-the-scenes decisions the filmmaking team faced from the earliest stages of development was structural. How do you dramatize a case that Netflix itself had already documented in exhaustive detail just a few years earlier? This was not a hypothetical concern raised only by critics after the fact. It appears to have been a genuine creative challenge the writers had to work through from the outset, given that so much of the raw material, including Elise's own first-hand account of her marriage and the events leading up to the murder, had already been captured on camera for the earlier docuseries. Rather than attempting to simply vestige that existing interview material or compete directly with the documentary's investigative, procedural approach, Montes and Torres made a clear creative choice to build the feature film as a psychological character study instead, something closer to an intimate dramatic reconstruction of the marriage itself than a forensic account of the crime and its investigation. Montes described this intention directly, stating that the goal was never simply to depict a crime, but to open up a broader conversation about the roots of violence and what factors could drive someone towards such a brutal act. Torres, for her part, described the film's ambition as an attempt to show the duality within Elise as a person, framing the story as one that many people could relate to on some emotional level, even though it ultimately arrived at the worst possible outcome imaginable. This creative choice shaped nearly every subsequent decision made during production. The film was structured into 4 distinct chapters, a device that allowed the filmmakers to move through Elise's story in a fragmented, non-linear way rather than a strict chronological retelling, opening with the immediate aftermath of the murder before circling backward through the years of the relationship that preceded it. This structural approach required careful coordination during the shoot itself, since scenes representing vastly different emotional registers and different points in the characters' relationship, from the earliest, most hopeful days of the courtship to the devastating confrontation that ends the marriage, needed to be shot in a way that would eventually interlock cleanly during the editing process. Even though film productions rarely shoot in the same order that scenes ultimately appear on screen, actors in a production like this are frequently required to shift emotional gears dramatically within the same shooting day or the same week, filming a tender, affectionate early relationship scene in the morning and then pivoting to a scene depicting deep marital breakdown or psychological strain in the afternoon, a demand that places significant technical and emotional discipline on the performers involved. Particularly Lorena Comparato, whose character undergoes the most dramatic arc of transformation across the film's full runtime. Casting the film also appears to have been approached with considerable care given the sensitivity of the subject matter. Beyond Lorena Comparato in the lead role and Enrique Kimura as Marcos, the production assembled a fairly extensive supporting cast to populate the wider Matsunaga family and Elise's own fractured family background, including Niwa Yanagisawa as Marcos's mother, Edson Kamita as his father, Julia Shimura as his cousin, and Arthur Toyoshima as his brother. Alongside Erica Montenhiro portraying Elise's mother, Murat Descartes as her stepfather, Denise Weinberg as her aunt, Gustavo Falcao as Marcos's best friend Aitor, and additional performers filling out roles connected to both sides of the story's emotional geography. Assembling a cast of this size for a film with a relatively modest 93-minute runtime, structured across only 4 chapters, meant that the production had to be efficient about how it allocated screen time to establish an entire extended family network on both sides of the marriage convincingly enough that audiences could track the social and emotional dynamics at play. Particularly the class tension between Elise's modest, difficult upbringing and the wealth and privilege of the Matsunaga family she married into. Because the film draws so heavily on a true and still relatively recent case, one of the genuine, well-documented challenges facing the production was the question of fairness and balance and how it portrayed real people who could not participate in shaping their own depiction. Critics who reviewed the finished film repeatedly raised this exact issue, noting that because the narrative is constructed so substantially from Elise's own perspective and her own previously recorded account of events, Marcos Matsunaga himself has no voice in either the original documentary or this dramatized retelling to contest or contextualize the portrayal of his behavior, his infidelities, or his treatment of Elise throughout their marriage. This is not simply an abstract critical complaint. It represents a real and significant creative and ethical tightrope that the writers, director, and producers had to walk throughout the making of the film, attempting to construct a story that felt psychologically honest and dramatically compelling while working from source material that was, by necessity, one-sided, since the one person whose perspective could have complicated or challenged that account was no longer alive to offer it. The filmmaking team's response to this challenge, based on how the finished film plays out, was to lean into ambiguity rather than certainty, deliberately declining to hand down a clear moral verdict on Elise's culpability or victimhood, and instead allowing both readings, that she was a woman driven to a desperate act by sustained psychological and emotional abuse, and that she may have acted with a degree of calculation tied to the substantial Matsunaga family fortune, to sit uneasily alongside one another without fully resolving in either direction. The physical production itself was clearly designed to root the story within a very specific, tightly contained world, principally the Sao Paulo apartment where Elise and Marcos lived together, and where the murder ultimately took place. Much of the film's dramatic tension, according to reviewers who engaged closely with its visual and structural choices, comes from how claustrophobic and interior the storytelling feels, keeping audiences largely confined to the domestic spaces of the marriage rather than opening the story out into a broader procedural investigation involving police work or courtroom proceedings. This creative choice, again, reflects the film's underlying ambition to function as an intimate character study rather than a conventional true crime thriller, and it placed considerable weight on the production design and cinematography teams to make that single central apartment setting feel dynamic and emotionally varied enough to sustain the story's shifting tone across years of dramatized time. From the early excitement of a new relationship through the slow, grinding erosion of trust and affection that the screenplay traces in such deliberate detail. One of the more specific and widely discussed sequences from the film, frequently singled out by reviewers analyzing its visual storytelling choices, is an early hunting trip that Elise and Marcos take together relatively early in their relationship. Multiple critics who reviewed the film pointed to this particular sequence as a moment where the direction and Comparato's performance work together to hint, through subtle shifts in body language and demeanor rather than through any explicit dialogue, that Elise may have always carried within her a certain undercurrent of capacity for violence, well before the events that would eventually define her public identity. The inclusion and careful staging of a scene like this reflects a deliberate directorial choice on Felipe Velez's part, planting a visual seed early in the narrative that thoughtful viewers can look back on once the film reaches its violent conclusion, a technique that requires careful blocking, camera placement, and performance calibration to land effectively without tipping over into heavy-handed foreshadowing. Given the TVMA rating attached to the finished film, covering strong violence, disturbing thematic material, mature sexual content, strong language, and references to domestic abuse, the production also would have required careful, deliberate choices around how explicitly to depict some of the story's most difficult content, including the abuse Elise experienced as a child and the violence of the murder itself. Based on how critics described the finished film, the production appears to have generally favored restraint and suggestion over graphic explicitness in its most disturbing sequences, using sound design, editing, and implication rather than direct visual depiction to convey the horror of certain moments, a choice that speaks to careful, considered decisions made during both the shooting and editing process about where exactly to draw the line between honoring the seriousness of the real events being depicted and avoiding gratuitous or exploitative imagery. What the production ultimately delivered, according to the range of critical responses the film received following its release, was a project that succeeded most clearly in its central performance, and in its quieter, more intimate character moments. While facing more consistent criticism for the inherent challenge of telling a story that Netflix's own documentary had already covered in such comprehensive detail just a few years earlier. Several reviewers noted that the film's 93-minute runtime left significant portions of the broader story underexplored compared to the 4-hour docuseries that preceded it, a structural limitation that speaks to one of the fundamental tensions of adapting an already thoroughly documented true crime case into a single feature-length dramatic film, where choices about what to include and what to compress or omit entirely carry real weight, both dramatically and ethically. Despite these structural challenges, the film found considerable commercial success following its release, climbing rapidly into the top rankings of Netflix's global charts within days of its debut, a testament to the enduring public fascination with the underlying case and to the strength of the central performance that anchors the finished production, even if the behind-the-scenes journey that produced it involved constant, careful negotiation between dramatic storytelling and the genuine, unresolved weight of a real tragedy that continues to divide public opinion in Brazil more than a decade after it occurred. Cultural and historical context of Elise, Shadows of a Woman. To fully understand why Elise, Shadows of a Woman resonated so powerfully with audiences, particularly within Brazil, it is necessary to step back from the film itself and look at the layered cultural, historical, and social terrain the story is built upon. This is not simply a crime drama plucked from imagination. It is a fictionalized reconstruction of a case that has spent more than a decade lodged in the Brazilian national consciousness, one that intersects with the country's ongoing struggle with domestic violence legislation, its complicated history of Japanese immigration and integration, its deep and persistent class divisions, and a centuries-old cultural habit of sorting women who commit violence into rigid, moralizing archetypes. Understanding these layers transforms the film from a simple retelling of a lurid murder into something closer to a mirror held up against several unresolved tensions in modern Brazilian society. The weight of a real and unresolved case. The murder at the center of this film took place in May of 2012, when Elise Matsunaga shot her husband Marcos Caetano Matsunaga at close range inside their apartment in one of São Paulo's more affluent districts, before dismembering his body and scattering the remains along a rural road outside the city in the area of Coxa. The case immediately became what Brazilian media outlets and commentators have since described as one of the most emblematic and closely followed crimes in the country's recent history, and its cultural footprint only grew larger with time rather than fading, as is often the case with sensational news stories. Part of what made the case endure so powerfully in the public imagination was the way in which nearly every element of it seemed engineered, almost by cruel coincidence, to generate maximum public fascination. There was enormous wealth on one side and precarious poverty on the other. There was a marriage built on a foundation of infidelity and secrecy. There was jealousy, a stark social gap between the two people involved, an act of shocking physical violence, and then a chilling, methodical attempt to conceal the crime by disposing of a body in pieces. Any one of these elements alone might have generated a news cycle. Together, they created something that has continued to occupy space in Brazilian cultural discourse for well over a decade, discussed in law school papers, feminist commentary, true crime documentaries, and now, twice over, in Netflix productions. What is particularly notable about the way this case has been revisited across the years is how consistently it keeps circling back to the same unresolved central question, one that the film itself deliberately refuses to answer definitively. Was Elise Matsunaga a woman who endured sustained psychological abuse and ultimately snapped under the weight of years of humiliation and control, or was she a calculating individual who saw an opportunity, given her husband's position as heir to a substantial food company fortune, and acted with premeditated intent to benefit from his death and inheritance? Brazilian media and legal commentary reflected the same divide that had characterized public reaction from the very beginning, with prosecutors and skeptics pointing to inconsistencies in her account of the killing and the calculated nature of the body's disposal, while others emphasized documented aspects of her difficult childhood and the coercive dynamics of her marriage as mitigating context, even if not full justification, for what she ultimately did. This ambiguity is not a flaw in the storytelling. It is, in many ways, the entire reason the story has remained culturally alive in Brazil for so long, because it refuses to resolve into a simple morality tale, forcing audiences and commentators alike to sit with genuine discomfort about where responsibility, circumstance, and culpability actually intersect. The Maria da Penha law and Brazil's reckoning with domestic violence. No discussion of the cultural context surrounding this film would be complete without addressing the Maria da Penha law, one of the most significant pieces of legislation in Brazil's modern legal history and a constant reference point in Brazilian conversations about domestic violence, including conversations directly connected to the Matsunaga case. The law takes its name from Maria da Penha Maia Fernandes, a biopharmacist from Fortaleza who survived 2 attempts on her life by her own husband, including being shot in the back while she slept, an attack that left her permanently paralyzed. After Brazil's domestic judicial system failed for nearly 2 decades to deliver meaningful accountability, her case was eventually brought before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which formally found Brazil responsible for negligence and systemic failure in protecting women from domestic violence. This international ruling directly led to the passage of Federal Law 11,340 in August of 2006, now universally known across Brazil simply as the Lei Maria da Penha, a law that fundamentally reshaped how the Brazilian legal system classifies, prosecutes, and attempts to prevent domestic and family violence against women, establishing specialized courts, shelters, and significantly increased penalties in cities with substantial populations. The Matsunaga case emerged just 6 years after this landmark law took effect, and it has since become a frequent touchstone in Brazilian public discussions about the law's real-world limitations and its continued relevance. Public forums, academic theses, and legal commentary have repeatedly placed Elise Matsunaga's case in direct conversation with other prominent Brazilian cases involving violence against women, using her story specifically to interrogate the gap between having strong legislation on paper and actually ensuring that protective mechanisms reach the women who need them, reach them in time, and are properly understood and utilized. This connection deepened further with the 2015 passage of Brazil's femicide law, which formally established the killing of a woman specifically because of her gender as an aggravated form of homicide under Brazilian Criminal Code, a legislative response to the recognition that the existing Maria da Penha framework, while transformative, had not on its own been sufficient to stem the tide of gender-based lethal violence across the country. When Elise, Shadows of a Woman arrived on Netflix in 2026, it did so during the same year that Brazil was marking the 20th anniversary of the Maria da Penha law, a coincidence of timing that gave renewed cultural weight to the film's exploration of coercive control, psychological manipulation, and the slow erosion of a woman's autonomy within a marriage defined by profound power imbalance. It is worth noting, in the interest of full context, that Elise's own case sits in complicated relationship to this legal and cultural framework precisely because she was not the victim in the legal sense that the Maria da Penha law was designed to protect, but the perpetrator of a killing. This is part of what has made her story such a persistently uncomfortable and generative subject for feminist commentary in Brazil specifically. Rather than fitting neatly into the framework of a woman failed by protective systems who then became a victim of lethal violence herself, her story instead raises the more unsettling and complicated question of what happens when a woman subjected to sustained psychological control and diminishment responds not by seeking protection through legal channels, but by committing an irreversible act of violence herself. Brazilian commentators writing about the film and the broader case have explicitly framed this tension using a well-established feminist critique that traces how patriarchal culture has historically only permitted women a narrow set of categories through which to be understood, categories often summarized in Brazilian cultural criticism using the shorthand of the madwoman, the saint, and the prostitute. 3 flattened archetypes that have long been used to explain and contain women who deviate from expected social roles. Elise Matsunaga's story, and by extension this film's dramatization of it, has been repeatedly analyzed through exactly this lens, with commentators noting that public discourse around her has shifted between all 3 categories simultaneously, sometimes within the same conversation, an unstable, overlapping set of judgments that says as much about the persistence of these old patriarchal categories in Brazilian culture as it does about Elise herself. The Matsunaga family and the history of Japanese immigration to Brazil. A significant and often underexplored dimension of this story's cultural context involves the Matsunaga family itself, and the much broader history of Japanese immigration to Brazil that their name and their business empire represent. Marcos Matsunaga was heir to Yoki, one of Brazil's most recognizable food companies, a business empire whose very name and origin story is deeply woven into the fabric of Japanese-Brazilian immigrant history. Yoki was established by Yoshizo Kitano, a Japanese immigrant entrepreneur, with the company's name itself formed from the first letters of his own name and surname, Y from Yoshizo and Ki from Kitano, a name that also carries meaning in Japanese connected to happiness, achievement, and prosperity. Kitano's company transformed the Brazilian food market over the following decades, shifting flours and grains that had traditionally been sold loose and in bulk into modern packaged products, and introducing innovations to Brazilian kitchens including microwave popcorn and the country's first ready-to-eat version of farofa, a staple Brazilian side dish made from toasted cassava flour. By the time General Mills, the massive American food conglomerate, acquired Yoki in 2012, the same year as the murder, the company was reporting over 1 billion reais in annual sales and employed more than 5,000 people across Brazil, underscoring just how significant the Matsunaga and Kitano family business empire truly was within the Brazilian economy. This business success story cannot be separated from the much larger and often difficult history of Japanese immigration to Brazil, a migration story that began in 1908 when the ship Caçado Maru arrived at the port of Santos carrying the first wave of Japanese immigrant families, drawn to Brazil through an immigration agreement designed to supply labor for the country's booming coffee plantations following the abolition of slavery in 1888. What followed over the ensuing decades was one of the largest sustained waves of Japanese emigration anywhere in the world, and today Brazil is home to the largest population of Japanese descendants living outside Japan itself, concentrated overwhelmingly in the state of São Paulo, with significant communities also established in Paraná and other southern and southeastern regions. This history was neither smooth nor uncomplicated. Early Japanese immigrants faced significant hardship on Brazilian coffee plantations, experienced periods of intense discrimination and suspicion, particularly during and after the Second World War when Brazil, aligned with the Allied powers, banned Japanese language schools and publications and viewed the Japanese immigrant community with considerable wartime hostility. Despite these obstacles, the Japanese-Brazilian community, often referred to using the Japanese term Nikkei, gradually built a reputation across the 20th century as a highly successful immigrant group, moving from agricultural labor into urban professional and business classes by the 1960s and beyond. A trajectory the Kitano and Matsunaga families' own rise from immigrant entrepreneurship to major Brazilian industrial wealth exemplifies almost perfectly. Understanding this history adds an important layer of texture to the film's exploration of class and social position, because the wealth and status that so profoundly separated Marcos from Elise throughout their relationship was not simply generic Brazilian upper-class privilege in the abstract. It represented the culmination of a specific immigrant success story, a family that had climbed from the position of agricultural newcomers facing wartime suspicion and discrimination into one of the most recognizable and financially powerful business dynasties in the country within the span of a few generations. This adds a layer of irony and complexity to the film's class dynamics that Brazilian audiences, deeply familiar with the cultural weight and history carried by a name like Matsunaga or Kitano, would likely register far more immediately and viscerally than international viewers encountering the story for the first time. The film's portrayal of Marcos's family, including their coldness toward Elise and their difficulty even remembering her name correctly, gains an additional dimension when understood against this backdrop of a proud, hard-won immigrant success story protecting its accumulated status and reputation against what the family likely perceived as an unsuitable outside match. Class, the escort industry, and São Paulo's social geography. Beyond the specific history of the Matsunaga family, the film sits within a much broader and persistent Brazilian cultural preoccupation with class division, a theme that runs through an enormous amount of the country's most acclaimed film and television output. São Paulo, The setting for the bulk of the story is a city of extraordinary and often jarring contrasts, home to some of Latin America's greatest concentrations of private wealth existing in close physical proximity to significant poverty and precarity, a geography of inequality that has shaped Brazilian storytelling across generations. Elise's background as a young woman from Chopinzinho, a small and relatively poor town in the interior state of Paraná, who eventually made her way to Sao Paulo and turned to escort work as a means of survival and economic independence, situates her story within this well-established Brazilian narrative tradition of the outsider navigating, and ultimately being consumed by, the city's vast and unforgiving social hierarchy. The specific detail of Elise's work as an escort carries its own cultural weight within Brazilian society, a profession that exists in a particularly fraught social position, often stigmatized publicly while simultaneously representing, for some women without other economic options, one of the few available paths toward the kind of financial independence and access to elite social circles that would otherwise remain entirely out of reach. Brazilian commentary on the case has repeatedly noted how quickly and how permanently this detail of her biography came to dominate public perception of her, functioning almost as a kind of permanent character marker that shaped how much of the country interpreted everything else about her subsequent story, from her marriage to Marcos to the eventual murder itself. This reflects a broader and long-documented pattern in how Brazilian media and public discourse tend to treat women whose lives intersect with sex work, regardless of the specific circumstances, a pattern the film itself seems conscious of and attempts, at least partially, to complicate by spending considerable time establishing the desperate economic and psychological circumstances of Elise's earlier life that led her toward that profession in the first place. The role of Netflix in Brazilian true crime as a cultural force. It is also worth situating this film within the broader and rapidly growing cultural phenomenon of Brazilian true crime content on global streaming platforms, a genre that has exploded in popularity over the past several years and that Netflix in particular has invested in heavily as part of its Brazilian content strategy. The decision to revisit the Matsunaga case a second time, first through the 2021 documentary series Elise Matsunaga, Once Upon a Crime, directed by Elisa Kapai and built around Elise's own first public interview from prison, and then again through this fictionalized dramatic retelling 5 years later, reflects the particular power this specific case continues to hold within Brazilian popular culture. A story that streaming executives clearly believe still had substantial audience appetite behind it even after an already exhaustive documentary treatment. This pattern of revisiting the same true crime story across multiple formats and genres is not unique to Brazil, but it takes on a particular cultural significance here given how deeply the Matsunaga case is embedded in Brazilian collective memory, comparable in some ways to how certain infamous cases have been repeatedly revisited across multiple documentaries, dramatizations, and podcasts in other countries, each new version promising some fresh angle or deeper psychological insight into events the public already technically knows the outcome of. This also connects to a distinctly Brazilian tradition of what commentators sometimes describe using the framework of the crime of passion, a cultural and, at times, even quasi-legal concept with deep historical roots in Brazilian jurisprudence and popular consciousness, referring to violent acts committed in a state of overwhelming emotional distress triggered by betrayal or heartbreak. Brazilian legal history includes a long and controversial tradition of defense arguments built around this framework, historically used, particularly in past decades, to argue for leniency in cases where men killed unfaithful wives or partners, a legal and cultural double standard that Brazilian feminist legal scholars have spent decades working to dismantle. The Matsunaga case represents an unusual and culturally significant inversion of this pattern, a woman invoking a framework of overwhelming emotional distress and provocation that had historically been deployed almost exclusively to excuse violence committed by men against women, a reversal that itself generated considerable public debate and discomfort. Precisely because it forced a confrontation with uncomfortable questions about whether such frameworks of leniency should exist at all, for anyone, regardless of gender, or whether their application in this case represented a kind of rough, unintended justice given the broader pattern of how Brazilian courts had historically treated similar claims when made by men. The film's deliberate positioning within this cultural landscape. Understanding all of this context makes clear why the filmmakers behind Elise, Shadows of a Woman were so explicit in interviews about their intention to avoid delivering a simple, morally resolved narrative. Screenwriter Rafael Montez's stated goal of using the film to open up a broader conversation about the roots of violence, rather than simply cataloging the details of a crime, reflects a clear awareness of the dense cultural, legal, and historical terrain the story already occupied in the Brazilian public imagination well before the cameras ever started rolling. The film's deliberate choice to structure itself around Elise's own subjective experience of her marriage, drawing heavily on the same first-person account she gave for the earlier documentary, represents a specific and consequential creative decision, one that Brazilian critics and cultural commentators have noted places the audience inside a distinctly one-sided account of events, since Marcos himself, obviously, has no ability to offer his own competing version of the same marriage. This structural choice is not incidental. It reflects the same feminist critical framework that has shaped so much of the broader public conversation about this case over the past decade, an insistence on taking seriously the internal, subjective experience of a woman whose story might otherwise be reduced entirely to a set of gruesome forensic facts, even while acknowledging, as many thoughtful Brazilian commentators writing about the film have been careful to note, that taking her perspective seriously as a narrative device does not require accepting it as objectively complete or beyond question. Ultimately, Elise, Shadows of a Woman functions as far more than a standalone crime thriller. It sits at the intersection of Brazil's ongoing and unfinished legislative reckoning with domestic and gender-based violence, the complicated multigenerational history of Japanese immigration, and the specific immigrant success story embodied by the Matsunaga and Kitano family fortune, deep and enduring patterns of Brazilian class division centered around Sao Paulo's stark social geography. A long cultural history of rigid, moralizing archetypes used to categorize and judge women who transgress expected social roles, and a rapidly evolving genre of Brazilian true crime storytelling that has found significant global audiences through platforms like Netflix. Watching the film with this fuller context in mind transforms it from a simple, sensational retelling of a shocking murder into something considerably more layered, a story that continues to force Brazilian society, and now a substantial global audience as well, to sit with genuinely difficult and unresolved questions about power, complicity, violence, and the deeply uneven ways different lives and different deaths come to be understood, judged, and remembered. That brings us to the end of this deep dive into the cultural and historical layers running beneath Elise, Shadows of a Woman. If this exploration added meaningful depth to your understanding of the film and the real story behind it, do not forget to like this video, share it with fellow true crime and cultural analysis enthusiasts, and subscribe to Review and Facts for more detailed breakdowns just like this one.